Welcome to the Emerging Civil War Podcast. I'm Chris Makowski, and joining me today from the great state of Tennessee is my friend Greg Biggs. How you doing today, Greg?
Hey, Chris, very good, thank you. We had finally warm weather. I think we're done with the cold for a little while. So
You have just jinxed yourself.
thank you. Thanks very much. I've been in four snowfalls this year. Three of them are in Tennessee. Only one north of the Ohio River. So something to
So
call.
I want you to think about Grant's men going from Henry to Donelson and the bitter,
Mhm.
bitter cold. That's you have just brought that back upon yourself.
Night of the 13th, the big weather change. Yep,
Yeah. So sorry
13th
about
of
that,
February.
man.
Well, you know.
So I've asked Greg to come on because in my mind, Greg is Mr. Fort Donelson,
Well,
and
thank you.
just wanted to kind of talk a little bit about the implications of Fort Donelson and what that means. At the time we're recording this, we're sort of between the Donelson campaign and the Shiloh campaign, and really Shiloh is kind of a direct result of what happens at Forts Henry and Fort Donelson. And so the implications of the Donelson campaign, I think sometimes get forgotten, or maybe kind of people think of them in too small of terms. And so I really wanted to bring Greg on today and talk a little bit about that because Greg's got a very expansive view about what the implications of that campaign are. Before we kind of get into some of those big, broad, sweeping things, though, Greg, tell us just a little bit. Give us the recap. What's Fort Henry, Fort Donelson? How does that all unfold?
Well, it's basically the defense of Tennessee, and if you look at a map of the Western Theater from the Cumberland Gap area in the Appalachians to the Mississippi River, you have three rivers that bisect the defense line of what's going to be Confederate Department Number Two, which will come under the command, excuse me, of Albert Sidney Johnston in the fall of 1861. Once he makes that couple thousand-mile trek across the western deserts to outrunning the U.S. Army patrols out of Fort Bliss and the Apaches and Arapahoes and whoever else is trying to catch them, and walks into Richmond, Virginia. And he was good friends with Jefferson Davis, and Davis is sick in bed, and he goes, "I know those footsteps anywhere. That's Sidney Johnston's bootsteps." And so he's going to get tasked with commanding Department Number Two. That's a good thing, I guess, but he's not given any extra troops to command Department Number Two, which is going to be done on a shoestring. So if you look at that defense line I'm talking about from Cumberland Gap in the east to the Mississippi River and even across the Mississippi River, Sidney Johnson has somewhere between 40 and 45,000 men, which is utterly impossible to hold that extensive of a line with that few troops because you're going to be able to concentrate on certain places, Bowling Green, when the Confederates move up there, Henry Donelson, Clarksville, where I live, Nashville to some extent, and then Columbus, Kentucky, on the Kentucky side of the river. So the key thing is you've got the Mississippi River on the western side of Tennessee, the Cumberland and the Tennessee next, and then the Cumberland River. So if you've got a defense line that goes this, it's bisecting that defense line in three places.
Basically,
Which
going
would make
perpendicular.
Yes, yes, exactly, perpendicular to the line of defense. And these are all boat navigable rivers that go at least on the Tennessee River as far as the Muscle Shoals, Florence, Alabama area, and in Nashville, going through Nashville up about as I think it's about as far as Hartsville for Ohio River style deep draft 6 foot draw of water steamboats, and then the Mississippi River from St. Paul all the way to the Gulf. Um, and it comes down to Tennessee being late to the party. They tried to secede in February of 61, and they don't do it like the first seven states do. The legislature will pass a ordinance of secession, but put it to a plebiscite of the people, and the people will vote it down. So after the Fort Sumter event of April 1861, the legislature puts another ordinance of secession. They pass it, put it to the vote of the people, and it's officially passed on June 8th of 1861. And of course, after Sumter's when you get the four upper South states, Arkansas, Virginia, North Carolina, and Tennessee going out, and Tennessee being the last of the party. Tim Smith brings up an interesting thing in his Fort Donelson book of the mistrust between the Deep South Confederates, the couple Alabama regiments and Mississippi regiments that come up to fight here, and the Tennessee troops. Like, well, these guys are Johnny come latelys. How quote unquote Confederate are they? That kind of stuff. And the geography of Tennessee, the western part from the Tennessee River to the Mississippi River is what we call the Jackson Purchase, purchased by Andrew Jackson and Isaac Shelby from the Chickasaws after the state is actually kind of formed. That covers the western part of Kentucky as well, from the Tennessee to the Mississippi River. And that's the overwhelmingly pro-Confederate part. And then where I live in Middle Tennessee, you have pockets of pro-Confederate where I live. Nashville gets a little dicey. Further south of Nashville, the town of Shelbyville, which figures big time in the Tullahoma campaign, that was founded by people from Massachusetts. I mean, that's a heavily unionist town. And then even within West Tennessee, McNairy County, I believe it is, down close to Shiloh, is a heavily unionist county. And it comes down to trade, river trade, railroad trade. Where's your money going to come from? Kentucky doesn't join the Confederacy because the bulk of their trade goes north of the Ohio River. So the only way you're going to get Kentucky into the Confederacy, if a Confederate army moves into that state, stays there, and beats anything the Federals are going to throw at it, then you might get a lot of the Kentuckians coming off the fence. But Larry Daniel, in his recent book on the Army of Tennessee, says 70% of Kentucky's military age manpower says, no, we're not fighting for either side. That's he told me recently, I saw him at a conference, about 160,000 men that were military age men that set out the Civil War. I mean, that's a staggering number. So Tennessee, when Kentucky declares itself neutral in April of 61, actually May, they do so because Governor Beriah McGoffin, who's the pro-Confederate governor of the state, is dealing with a pro-unionist legislature. And because McGoffin authorizes the raising of the 1st Kentucky Infantry Regiment Confederate, which are 2 battalions that form the regiment, they get shipped off to Manassas. They're in the Manassas campaign in the summer of 61. They're guarding the railroad depot, but they're there. And the pro-unionist legislature gets really mad at this. And they work at a neutrality issue, which Kentucky will be neutral in the war. You have the pro-Confederate, but still incredibly well-equipped Kentucky State Guard, which had formed a year or two earlier than that. And they're funded by the blue blood, cha-ching horse money, which is still huge in the state of Kentucky. If you don't believe me, come to Louisville during Kentucky Derby time. Private jets all over the place at the airport there. So, I mean, they've got tall bearskin shakos like Napoleon's Old Guard. They've got imported British Enfield rifle muskets because they had the money to buy that stuff. There's some great pictures of them at their training camp in the Louisville area in 1860, and you're looking at almost like, wow, this is like Napoleon's Old Guard here. There's a number of pro-unionists in there and a number of pro-Confederates in there. But McGoffin, once he works out with the legislature, their mission is going to be to keep the Union Army out of the state and the Confederate Army out of the state. Now, dropping back to Tennessee briefly here, Governor Isham Harris, and if you live in Tennessee long enough, you're taught that Isham Harris secedes and takes Tennessee with him, is happy Kentucky's sitting it out because that puts a huge cap along the entire northern border of the state of Kentucky. So looking at the map, if you're the governor of Kentucky, Chris, and you're raising troops, by the way, starting in April of 61, where are you going to send the bulk of your manpower? Mississippi River, right? That's your obvious. And Lincoln has made no bones about opening the Mississippi River, tying in with Scott's Anaconda Plan. Lincoln had been on the river as a young man. He knew the power of the river. I go back in my program to late 1814, when a British officer under General Robert Pakenham, who's coming after New Orleans, says whoever controls the Mississippi River controls North America. That's 1814. Think about it in 1860, 61 with the growth of industry and agriculture and population and everything else. I mean, controlling the Mississippi River is amazingly crucial. But then he looks in the summer of 61 and says, we've got these other 2 rivers coming through my state, and I better do something about that. And your typical defense for a river ingress is a fortification of some sort. And on the Mississippi River side, there's Fort Pickering in Memphis, which is an old fort that they refurbish. And then going north, you'll get Fort Harris, Fort Randolph, Fort Pillow, which gets infamous in 1864, culminating with right across from New Madrid. It's spelled Madrid, but pronounced Madrid, Missouri. And then in early September 1861, Leonidas Polk, who's been given command of the District of West Tennessee, Tennessee River, the Mississippi River, under Sidney Johnston, will take his troops up to Hickman, Kentucky. I think it's September 2nd, and then the next day we'll capture Columbus, Kentucky. You've been to Columbus, Kentucky, I trust? You're about 200 feet above the river. It'll end up with 142 pieces of heavy artillery, the Gibraltar of the West, it gets called. Now, a lot of historians have slammed Polk for violating Kentucky's neutrality. I did a deep dive on this several years ago. There were a lot of violations of that, starting with Union gunboats sailing up the Cumberland River and seizing transports because they thought they carried quote unquote contraband military goods for the Confederate Army. Some were, some weren't. In fact, the guy that was commanding Cairo before Grant got there was Benjamin Prentice of the later of the Hornets' Nest at Shiloh. And the Confederate newspapers called them Prentice's buzzards. We're sailing up the Cumberland River. This is when the three timberclad boats, the Lexington, the Tyler, and the Conestoga, which were converted at Cincinnati, start patrolling the river to project Union power. So they start inspecting boats and seizing weapons and things of that nature. But initially, both sides tried to honor the neutrality thing. So if you were a Unionist in Kentucky and you wanted to join the Union Army, you went to one of two places. Across the river from Louisville is Jeffersonville, Indiana. So they made a training camp there. And by the way, that's where the Louisville Quartermaster Depot is going to be built during the war, too, which is perfect because there's no bridge at the time across the Ohio River there. So that's a great place to put your major clothing depot or Quartermaster Depot, the Western Theater. And then outside Cincinnati, Ohio, there was another training camp. The Confederates, those who wanted to be in the Confederate Army, largely came to my area, Clarksville, where they would open Camp Boone. The 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Kentucky Confederate will be there. And then the 4th Kentucky Confederate gets mad at the other two and moves a couple miles up the road towards Kentucky, and they will found Camp Burnett, named for H.C. Burnett, the only pro-Confederate congressman that wins election in the summer of '61. And they kind of get their revenge on the 2nd, 3rd because they're on Spring Creek. Well, Spring Creek flows from Camp Burnett to Camp Boone. And if you know anything about camps, where do you put your latrines? Where your drinking water comes from or below the drinking water. So all the latrine stuff is flowing by Camp Boone. But then that's the genesis of the famous Orphan Brigade of Western Kentucky Confederates. There were some camps out in West Tennessee around the Union City area where some men would move, mainly to join Tennessee regiments. But those 3 Kentucky regiments and some other, like Gray's Battery, will form there. Woodard's Battalion, the Oak Grove Rangers will form there. And then in the summer to early fall of '61, when the Bowling Green thing happens, Sidney Johnston pulls everybody out of Nashville and Clarksville, et cetera, and goes up to Bowling Green because initially, so you got Cumberland Gap with my right hand, and the Mississippi River with the left hand, and your line went convex, with Nashville being at the bottom of the bowl. So when the neutrality issue falls apart, it becomes concave. So you now have Bowling Green and Russellville, Kentucky, and Hopkinsville, Kentucky. And so now the line is much more like this. And that gives the Confederates interior lines.
And that's still like such a long frontier for Albert Sidney Johnston to have to defend. Part of it is Jefferson Davis's insistence that we've got to defend everything at this point, rather than maybe being a little bit more strategic. But part of that is really kind of fueled by a lot of political considerations because you have all these different governors saying, you've got to defend this, you got to defend this, you got to defend this. So it seems like
Exactly.
Johnston is sort of sandwiched between the military necessity and the political necessity here. And how does he fare during that period?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because that's something I think a lot of people leave out is from a purely military point of view, you're right. Pick your weakest points and not only build fortifications there, but you need forces of maneuver and preferably some kind of gunboat fleet to back it up because you're talking about rivers. I mean, what exactly are the Union doing at this time? They're building gunboats. You got the 3 timberclads, you'll have the 7 city-class ironclads, and 2 conversions, the USS Essex and the most powerful of the boats, the USS Benton. So the Union gets it. The U.S. Navy initially doesn't get it. I'm convinced that somewhere in the bowels of the Washington Navy Yard is an old book about this thick from 1860 that says that which the U.S. Navy does, and you open it up, and the table of contents, nope, nothing about rivers, closed. And so, but the Navy was smart enough to send Captain John Rogers, who becomes a major naval player later on in the war, to Cincinnati to start those gunboat conversions. Well, the Confederates do that too. They build a fleet in New Orleans. And they will send 8 of those ships up the Mississippi River, and there'll be some gunboat battles in the Fort Pillow area, like Plum Run Bend. They'll be trying to threaten Cairo. Of course, the Battle of Memphis, where they're absolutely annihilated, in front of the home crowd up on the bluffs, like, yay, go team, and then watching their ships
Ooh,
get blown
yeah.
out of the water. Not a good day for them. But so you've got the naval component. The Confederates do, but not enough. They don't have the manufacturing capability to make enough of these gunboats to roll the iron plate, which has to come from rolling mills like the Atlanta rolling mill, the small Etowah rolling mill, Tredegar in Richmond, and I think there's one more um, in the deep south in Alabama. I think a small, very small rolling mill. So you got to take what you're rolling railroad iron, but making it flat plates, and then you ship it to where you're building ironclads. And then you've got the machinery, the engines that make these things go, and those are woefully underpowered. If you know anything about anybody knows anything about the Confederate ironclads. So the political thing is, yeah, you and I maybe as purely military guys, you're looking at let's fix like Fort Pillow, that's pretty good, but build a maneuver army and a fleet. Henry Donaldson actually, once the Kentucky violation, neutrality violation falls apart, it should have moved up to Lineport, which is just over the line. The isthmus is only about 3 to 4 miles wide, but the mission of building the forts where they were had to be below that Kentucky state line for the neutrality and above the Memphis and Clarksville and Louisville railroad bridge. So you have a very narrow place where you can build fortifications. And then Bowling Green is fortified. Sidney Johnston orders Nashville to be fortified, and it never is. I could take you around some places in Nashville that have been fabulous for river fortifications. There's a small fort they built in the first bend west of downtown, Fort Zollicoffer, that only has 8 guns, but there were other places that could have been better. And then with the railroad connections, you could easily shove troops and supplies in and out of there. Nashville was a pretty big, important depot. So then adding the political element, you're a congressman from Mississippi, Arkansas, whatever, and the edict comes down from Jeff Davis. We're going to abandon your state or region because we can't defend it. What's that guy? He's going to hear an earful from his constituents, and that guy's going to walk down to Jefferson Davis's office and give him an earful. The interesting thing is you have two republics at war, probably for the first time in history. The Athenians and Syracusans were both pure democracies, but these are republics we're talking about, United States and Confederate States. If you can think of another time when two republics squared off, I'm all ears. But so you've got to keep your voter happy to gain political support. And studying things like World War II, America, the Arsenal of Democracy, where we just made bazillions of everything, that only works when you have the support of the people for the goal of the national security interest. If you lose that will, as the Confederates will slowly do throughout the war, you're in trouble. You are in big, big trouble. That's the one weakness of a republic at war is the support of the people. You've got to keep them in your camps. That means protecting their farms, protecting their factories, protecting their businesses, protecting the cities they live and work in. So unfortunately for the Confederates, they had to do on all things at all places time or set up, and they just don't have the initial manpower to do it.
Now, I think one of Sidney Johnson's successes at this point, he makes a lot of noise that drives Sherman literally crazy. Sherman's in charge of some of the Union defenses here, and that's where he has his supposed nervous breakdown and takes some time off. But other than that, he's kind of at the whim of the Union Army to make the first move to decide kind of where this action is going to take place because he's having to defend that whole frontier, and the Union kind of gets to pick where it wants to concentrate.
Exactly. I don't know if you've read Tim Smith's recent book on Sidney Johnson. It's really good.
Yeah.
It's not a biography per se of him, but it's an analysis, I think, of what makes him tick. That he's always striving to be successful because he hadn't been at certain points in his life and military career. So the motivation is I want to be successful, successful. He plays, I think, a brilliant game of bluff poker when he moves up from Nashville to Bowling Green and creates the Army of Central Kentucky, which will later become Hardee's Corps. I think that is the heart and soul of what's going to become the Army of Tennessee. Hardee comes over with Claiborne and some Arkansas regiments, and you've got guys, Bowen's Missourians are there, and you got Floyd's Brigade from Virginia initially goes there before they're sent to Donaldson. Um, And he's looking at his defense line. He's got pretty good intel what's going on. He knows that Grant is building a force at Cairo, which he seizes within a day or two after the Confederates move into Columbus. And he does it without informing his boss, Henry Halleck. He sends his regiments to go, one to grab Paducah and one to grab Smithland, the confluence of the Ohio, Tennessee, Ohio, Cumberland rivers. And he's sending a telegram up to Halleck. I'm doing this because the Confederates did that. And Halleck goes, okay, good. Buell's building a huge army in Louisville, in the Department of the Ohio, Army of the Ohio. He outnumbers Grant almost 3-1. So he's got in fact, he'll loan Grant several brigades during the Henry Donelson campaign. And he's looking down the railroad at Nashville, and Sidney Johnston at Bowling Green knows exactly where he's looking. So he will play a great game of bluff poker. He will send Buckner's brigade up the Green River, which heads kind of northwest out of Bowling Green towards the Paducah area, just on a raid. And he'll destroy some of the locks on the Green River, because that river was boat navigable by small boats at the time, all the way to Bowling Green. And he wants to cut that angle of attack off. Claiborne's guys go out towards Glasgow along the railroad, and they mess up some stuff. You have Confederates pushing up towards the Green River Valley by Munfordville, which between Munfordville and the Nolan River to the north is almost like a DMZ, if you will. And you have the Battle of Rowlett Station in December of '61, where the 32nd Indiana Infantry under August Villick is attacked by the Terry's Texas Rangers, the Texas Cavalry, and they will actually form squares. That's the first battle I know in the Civil War where infantry formed square to repel the attack, and Colonel Terry is killed. His marker is right by the L&N railroad tracks. So you've got all of this going on, and Sherman, who's replaced Robert Anderson at Louisville, is sending in these notes to the War Department. We're going to need 250,000 guys just to subdue Kentucky. These Confederates are everywhere. I hear them marching under my bed at night, and the Assistant Secretary of War says, quote, he's loony. So that's where that comes from. And Sherman later says, I stood by Grant when he was drunk, and he stood by me when I was insane. That's the point he's talking about. So Sherman gets replaced. Buell will then later will ascend to command of that district or department and army, and he will start marching slowly down the L&N Railroad. So Sidney Johnston's looking at a big picture pretty well, but he fails in one thing as if you will, a corporate CEO. I have a lot of corporate experience, and every now and then my boss would stick his head in my office, what's going on, to keep his finger on the pulse of what my position covered. And if I butted heads against something, I'd go see him. And what Sidney Johnston does, though, is he puts blinders on when he gets to Bowling Green, and he's looking at Louisville. He issues orders for Nashville to be fortified. Does he ever get on the train and go down there to find out? No. You have the dueling brigadiers at Fort Henry and Donelson. Does he ever come down there to solve any of the squabbling? No. Does he even send Major General William J. Hardee, who could pull rank on these guys? No. He starts acting like a district commander, not a full-fledged department commander. So when Beauregard comes west, he gives him supervision over Polk west of the Mississippi River, or excuse me, west of the Tennessee River. So that's the adjunct of Department Number 2. And that's how Beauregard gets out. In fact, when Beauregard comes, and we'll talk about the interesting relationship between Grant and Halleck. The reason why Halleck will let Grant finally go at Fort Henry is the newspapers say Beauregard is coming west and bringing 15,000 troops with him. Well, one of those things is right. There are no 15,000 troops, but Beauregard is coming. But the perception is, oh my God, that's a full, Sidney Johnston would have loved 15,000 more troops, but they're not there.
But even then, Beauregard's reputation as one of the victors of Manassas, he's carrying a lot of reputation with him.
Yes, he is. And I think if you study his career, the battle plan of Shiloh is his. And if the mission is to shove Grant away from the Tennessee River into those swampy creek bottom there, his combat power is on the left and the center, and he's only got 2 brigades on the right. And that is supposedly Beauregard's tactical plan. That's a faulty plan. I think by saving Charleston in 62, 63, and then his great performance when he gets to Petersburg in June of 64. I think that Beauregard is a far better Beauregard than the 62 Beauregard.
Yeah.
He's learned, he's grown, he realizes his mistakes, and I think he's becomes a pretty darn good commander by 64. So yeah, that's the thing is he's trying to tell Polk what to do, and Polk will start his nice long career of disobeying any orders he doesn't particularly care for, which
Yeah.
is I just picked up a T-shirt recently with a thing of Braxton Bragg on it. Says, "Don't blame me, I had Polk."
So Johnson's doing kind of what he can do. He starts getting a little focused. His eye is on the wrong ball. And this is where Grant makes his move and decides to head down the Tennessee River to attack the first of these two forts at Fort Henry. But he doesn't really get left off the leash quite right away either. I mean, he's been having problems with Halleck and
Exactly.
kind of like back and forth and back and forth. And what is it that finally, well, you mentioned that the Beauregard's arrival finally gives
And the
Halleck
alleged
permission.
15,000 troops.
Yeah, and the 15,000 troops. But Grant takes advantage of that pretty quickly. Like he gets the go order and he goes pretty quickly. Um, why is it he's been looking at the Tennessee River and why is it he's been looking at Fort Henry?
This is the dichotomy between Halleck and Grant is amazing. When I do Army staff rides out for the Henry Donelson campaign, um, they are absolutely stunned that one of the principles of war is unity of command. So that means from the top theater commander all the way down to the division commander, everybody's singing from the same hymnal. If you want your army to be effective in a campaign, that's exactly what you have to have. And Halleck does not like Grant because of the pre-war reputation of him hitting the bottle. I often say if I was stuck out in some godforsaken post out west and there's no internet and no telephone and all that to call Julia and the kids, see how they're doing, and Pony Express might take 3 months for my letter to get there and 3 months for the letter. I might have crawled into a bottle too. But that's his reputation, and Halleck doesn't like that. The man Halleck wants is Charles Ferguson Smith, who had been commandant of cadets. Think I had that right at West Point when Sherman, Grant, and Halleck were there. And it's an interesting thing that when Grant gets the command of the District of Cairo and promoted brigadier, backdated to when he gets it, it predates Charles Ferguson Smith's promotion to that rank. And Grant feels a little weird about that because he reveres this guy.
Right.
And they work it out. And Smith says, "You're my superior officer. You give me an order, I'm going to obey it, period." And Grant basically, "I'm going to lean on you heavily for solid advice." So they build a great relationship. And that's the guy who Halleck wants. As I tell people, the guy's about as old line army as you could get other than Winfield Scott. And Scott was, 300 pounds and 60 plus years old by that time. An outstanding American officer. The army of the 19th century is Winfield Scott's creation. And so you've got that. So then Grant and the gunboats show up, and Flag Officer Andrew Hull Foote, who gets promoted from captain to flag officer, which is a one-star Navy rank at the time, and that way he can deal with a brigadier general on equal footing. So Grant can't tell him what to do; they can discuss and work out a plan.
And people forget, like, no, neither, because they're separate branches, neither of them had to obey the other. It really requires mutual compromise, respect, discussion, and consensus.
Exactly. And if you study joint Army Navy operations from the coast of the Carolinas in the fall of 61, the Outer Banks of North Carolina, Burnside's out that way, into 62, Army Navy cooperation throughout the entire Civil War wins every battle they engage in except one. Red River Campaign, May of 64.
Yeah.
And that probably has more to do with Banks being the Army commander than anything else. That's the only time they're defeated. And now they just squabble on an annual football game, and so they haven't buried the hatchet, I guess. But Army Navy cooperation is essential if you're going to wage war in the Western theater up until you can't use the deep draft rivers anymore. Like Sherman's campaign uses the deep draft rivers for patrolling the rivers to keep his supply line secure but you're not bringing in the stuff like Grant's bringing into Vicksburg or Donaldson or even to Shiloh, or some of those battles there. The focus changes. The rivers remain important, but now you're going to start using more railroad than when you get from like the Atlanta campaign, et cetera. So you've got to have that Army Navy cooperation. So there's gunboat reconnaissance of the Tennessee River. And when you go to, if you remember when we went to Fort Henry, I pointed out the tops of the trees. That was the top of Panther Island. And the Confederates zeroed their guns into the right of that, and they put torpedoes, mines, on the left-hand side. And the gunboat recons, they see the mines. They're pulling them out of the water. They go, okay, we're not going over here, type stuff. And they've got the big telescope, and they're counting embrasures at Fort Henry, which has 17 guns, most of them facing the river, a few of them facing the land side. So they have very, very good actionable intelligence on Fort Henry. And at one point, these reports are going back to Halleck, and Halleck is ignoring them. And I'll get to a reason why in just a second. Grant makes an appointment with him and says, I'd like to come up and discuss this. And Halleck goes, okay. So he gets on a steamboat, sails to St. Louis, brings his maps, walks into Halleck's office, lays out his maps. Okay, General Halleck, here's what I propose. Ding, 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 ding. And after 15 minutes, Halleck gets up and walks out. He just disdains Grant. I don't want to hear it. Then comes the report from Charles Ferguson Smith that goes directly to Halleck. And Smith's like, oh, well, I mean, Halleck's like, that. Well, there you go. Here's our plan. Wait a minute. It's the exact same thing Grant's been telling you for, a few weeks prior to that time. But it's got Smith's name on the dotted line. Halleck is the guy that actually comes up with the concept, though, of launching an offensive against Confederate weakness. And he views the Twin Rivers as weaker than going up against Columbus, Kentucky. And that's sound military thinking. You don't want to go strength on strength. You want to go strength on weakness where you can try to punch through. And you now have gunboats that are designed to do just that, take on fixed fortifications, hopefully punch on through, and then project power further down the rivers. So that's what they're thinking is when that report comes in to Halleck from Smith, he goes, okay, and then that headline I just talked about, Beauregard, 15,000 men. All right, General Grant, go. February 2nd, Grant will load up the transports at Cairo, and we'll sail to Paducah, Kentucky, and we'll start to project the power up the Tennessee River, keeping in mind the Tennessee flows south to north, as does the Cumberland. And that starts off the Fort Henry campaign.
And you talked about, kind of the depth of the river playing a role, and the ability for the Navy to use the rivers to be able to do that joint Army Navy coordination. So the Navy kind of gets the big win at Fort Henry.
Mm-hmm.
And although Grant's got a role, the weather sort of works against him. So tell us a little bit about the fall of Fort Henry and why that sort of sets the stage for the move to Donaldson.
Well, if you remember when we did the trust tour videos a couple of years ago, that is very hilly terrain. It's up and down, gully ridge, and stuff. When I go up north on business and I tell people, yeah, we just had 5 inches of snow in Clarksville last week, we're shut down. And my friends in Ohio look at me like, are you out of your mind? That's like, we laugh at that. Yeah, but you're like this and we're like this. So it's a big difference. So when you have gullies and ridges, and this campaign, like the Tullahoma campaign a couple of years later, or the following year and a half, is marked by rain, a lot of rain. In fact, the rivers will rise 2 feet an hour. I tell people there's no Tennessee Valley lock and dam system then. So and I tell people in the summertime, if you've got not a lot of rain, where's your water level going to be? Pretty darn low. We get our rains from about November through February, March is when we get the bulk of our rainfall. So the river is going to be like this. Well, we're talking about a February campaign. So the rivers are way up. They're flowing exceedingly powerfully, probably 3 to 4 knots. Those gunboats, ironclads, make 7 knots coming up. So it's like you and I can walk the speed of the gunboat there. So Grant is got a brilliant plan. He's thinking ahead of the curve in terms of, I don't want to just capture Fort Henry. I want the garrison. I want those 2,500 to 3,000 Confederates that are holding that fort. I want to take them off the chessboard. So he's going to send Smith's division down the West Bank aimed at Fort Hyman. And Fort Hyman don't start building until December of 61. It's across the river in Kentucky. It's on the high ground. looking down. And did you ever get over to Fort? We didn't on our tour, but did you get
We
ever?
did not. No, I mean, that's a relatively new unit of the park now, as I
Right.
understand it. Yep.
Unfortunately, you have to want to go. It's a 45-minute or so drive, but it's fantastic. When you get up there, you are looking down at Fort Henry. You put a battery of 6-pounders up there, and Fort Henry is untenable. So that is what Smith's division is going to do is capture Fort Henry and place artillery as sort of his plan B if the gunboats don't work, and we'll get to that. They don't just start shelling Fort Henry from above. Well, the commander and then McClernand's division will come down the east side of the river. So it's a double envelopment, if you will, with a river in between the two arms, designed to McClernand cutting off the garrison and Smith taking Fort Hyman, putting guns in there to force the capitulation. We got the garrison. Yay, 3,000 prisoners of war. So the rain stopped that because those gullies just start. We're on a high limestone dome here that starts south of Louisville, Kentucky, and goes to northern Alabama. So you're talking about soil that's only maybe 4 or 5 inches deep, and then you're hitting that limestone, so it saturates rapidly. So then the water, where you didn't know we are going to do a science class, did you? So science 101, water seeks its own level. So it's going to saturate and then flow into the gullies, and those gullies will become temporary creeks. So you've got McClernand's guys coming up these roads, dragging their wagons and their guns and marching, and they don't make it to cutting off the garrison's escape because of that delay. There's a couple Confederate cavalry companies out there that are doing some skirmishing with them. The way Lloyd Tillman, Brigadier General Lloyd Tillman, who was Kentucky State Guard initially, he's the commander of that area, and he's got a rocket battery on the west side, so that when he sees the rockets go up in the air, he knows the Federals are coming down that side of the river. And then that's when he had a steamboat there, so he sends it down to Paris Landing, pulls 2 regiments from Paris Landing, pulls the troops out of Fort Hyman, and says, "Get on the road to Fort Donelson. I know exactly what's going on," because he now has intel from both sides. The Union's advancing. They want to cut me off and bag the whole garrison. So he's going to stay behind with about 100 to 125 guys and fight a big gun action against the oncoming ironclads and try to buy them time for their escape to Donelson. And excuse me, because of McClernand coming straight down, the garrison going out under Adolphus Hyman, they have to cut across southeast and then turn northeast towards Donelson. So instead of about a 12-mile march, they're going to be making about a 15-mile march. And they're going to cross Standing Rock Creek 5 times, according to the reports. And they will eventually make it there. And then here come the ironclads. And the ironclads, when you've got your sloped bow armor like this, and you've got water level guns at Fort Henry, which you do, and the water rising, you're playing into the strength of that sloped armor. So that ball will hit it and then bounce. If it's a straight up side, it could possibly penetrate. The CSS Arkansas gets penetrated when she fights the Union fleet at Vicksburg because her sides are vertical; they're not sloped. And but they're putting ball. They see the gunboats coming. They start putting shots through the gun ports. They penetrate the casemate armor of the Essex. The 2 big guns there are a 10-inch smoothbore Columbiad and a 24-pounder rifled gun. Those are the 2 most powerful long-range guns. And they start ranging out there and start hitting these things. And you don't fire explosive shells. You're firing solid shot because you want kinetic energy to penetrate that gunboat armor. Well, one of those balls goes into the Essex casemate and hits the boiler, and the boiler cooks off. And 40, 50 people, including her skipper, get scalded, some to death. Yeah, it's gruesome. It's only exceeded by the USS Mound City in Arkansas in 1863 in the White River campaign. That's even worse.
What a terrible
So,
way to go.
no, yeah, exactly. I mean, guys are diving into the cold water of the river to try to assuage their pain. Yeah, horrible way to go. So the Essex, because when she's designed, she's a conversion, her boilers are on the gun deck. The City class boats, the guns are below the gun deck. So if the casemate's penetrated, if it's penetrated from the top, which is what sank the Mound City, you got problems. But if you're doing a casemate thing, it's no problem. So Essex is knocked out. The other boats are pummeled. Foote brings them into about 900 yards, which for an 8-inch smoothbore naval gun is, you and me with a pea shooter, that's point blank range. And supposedly the walls of Henry were about 20 feet thick. and those balls are going through like a hot knife through butter, just plunging, right through and knocking out guns. Then the 24 pounder blows up and kills some of its crew and wounds some of the crew. And then the other thing, you're pyramiding your solid shot by your guns, but you're having to run up to the powder magazine to get your powder bags. And you've got some ready powder. Well, when you look around and you see the water level slowly doing this, where your gunners are waist deep in water trying to fight these guns, and you're having to go further and further to get your powder detachment, to keep moving the powder up to higher ground. After about an hour and 45 minutes or so, Tillman realizes he's done all he can do and he will strike his colors. So Fort Henry has flooded so much that a naval officer gets into a skiff and rows the boat into the sally port. If you know anything about forts, you're supposed to walk into the port, ride a wagon, ride your horse, not take a boat. So he takes a boat in, gets Tillman's surrender of the post, and that's because McClernand couldn't get there in time, just because of the weather flooding those gullies and ravines and things of that nature. So score one for the Navy.
Now we'll talk about what happens, what actually happens next. But here's a moment where you raise, I think, a really intriguing what if of the Civil War, because now the Tennessee River is open. We've got naval boats that are in position to exploit that. They end up not. But walk us through what might have happened, because I think it's really important to understand this moment in that kind of context.
I agree, and I remember we talked about that when I had you guys out here a few years ago. Tim Smith in his book about Donaldson, and I was really flattered he sent me the manuscript of that to read before he published it, along with a couple other guys. And that was one point that he and I emailed back and forth. And I said, I couldn't agree with you more on this point. After the fall of Fort Henry, Seth Ledyard Phelps will take the three timber-clad gunboats, the Lexington, the Tyler, and the Conestoga, up the Tennessee River. He's got basically a 2.5 point mission. And the half point ties in with the second point. The first point is to damage the Memphis, Clarksville, and Louisville Railroad Bridge at Danville, Tennessee. That bridge had just opened in November of 1861. So you had direct rail connection from Bowling Green all the way to Memphis, Tennessee. It's a nominal east-west line. It kind of goes at an angle. The only true east-west line is the Memphis and Charleston, down in Mississippi, start to Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama, and back into Tennessee again to Chattanooga. They want to damage that bridge to make sure nothing can come up the railroad from Memphis to reinforce the Confederates. So Phelps gets there, damages the bridge. The other thing they're going for is they had actionable intelligence that the Confederates were building a very large ironclad at Cerro Gordo, Tennessee, which is just north of Shiloh battlefield. And they were. It was the CSS Eastport. So they pull up, and here's the Eastport. The hull's in the water. The casemate is wooded up. Started to put the iron on it. Some of the iron and other wood and other accoutrements and gear and engines are on the bank. So he will drop off one of the gunboats there, load everything up onto this hull, and we're going to tow it back. And then the other two sail up the Tennessee River to the Muscle Shoals, Florence, Tuscumbia, Alabama area. And they destroy a couple of Confederate transports. They seize some more supplies earmarked for the Eastport iron plate, et cetera, and loaded it up. And there was a nice, pretty railroad bridge there. You can walk across it, a lot of it today. And the townspeople like, oh, we're being really nice. Please don't destroy our nice, pretty railroad bridge. And he doesn't. And unfortunately, Sidney Johnson will use that a little bit later on, moving troops toward Shiloh. But, so he loads all this stuff up, goes back, picks up the other gunboat and the Eastport, and tows it back to the Eads Navy Yard in St. Louis or Carondelet. And it's completed as the USS Eastport, which will actually be more powerful than the Benton. A very powerful ironclad, and she will serve until the Red River campaign, where she sunk in the Red River campaign. So there's a what if. What if the Confederates could have gotten that ironclad into service?
Yeah.
That could have been an interesting fight. But when Phelps comes back and you read his report, he doesn't see a Confederate soldier for 200 plus river miles. Nothing. They find the abandoned camp of Crew's Tennessee Battalion. I'm a flag nerd. They capture the flag of Crew's Tennessee Battalion. They give it to one of the gunboat skippers, who are all civilians, by the way. A guy named John Duble. He takes it back to his hometown of St. Louis and puts it on display. God knows where it is now. But the key thing is he comes back and goes, there's not a Confederate anything all the way to Florence, Alabama. So pull out your map books, boys and girls, and let's look at where you could be going. You have a secure line of supply with a river. You have naval power. And even though you're going to replace a couple of 3 gunboats that got beat up at Fort Henry with the other gunboats that will show up at Donaldson, you project that power down to Florence, Alabama. Grant's got over 50 transports already under him for the campaign. Load them up with everything, wearing a blue suit, and shove them down to Eastport, Mississippi. Excuse me. March across land, take the railroad at Iuka, and capture Corinth. They're not going to. The closest Confederate soldier to the east is Chattanooga, and there's about 2,000 guys there. I don't know, other than down around New Orleans, there's a lot, because they're trying to protect New Orleans, because they're afraid of the Union Navy projecting power up, as Farragut will do in April of '62. So that's the great what if. So what if Grant shows up down in that part of Mississippi with 30 to 40,000 troops? And he's going to have to borrow some from Buell, because Halleck's facing 2 directions. I got to project power down the river, but I got to worry about Missouri. So his army's divided up. So Grant's got 25 to 30. He gets 3 brigades from Halleck during the Henry Donelson campaign. So you get some more troops and you shove them down. And there's no Battle of Shiloh, so we won't have a nice park to go to. But somewhere in northern Alabama, northern Mississippi, the Confederates are going to wake up and go, "Oh my God, our left flank has been completely turned. We can abandon Donaldson, abandon Nashville, Clarksville, Bowling Green. Everybody's going to have to beat feet down to Chattanooga, because Grant can now project power up and down the Memphis-Charleston Railroad. I can go to Memphis. I can seize Chattanooga. You seize Chattanooga in March, April of '62. Wins the Atlanta campaign, not '64. So that to me is, there's a second what if that comes a little bit later with Ormsby Mitchell's division coming over the mountain and capturing the northern part of Alabama and threatening Chattanooga. It's a similar thing. There's no Confederates down there. So because they've got that crust defense, everything's up in Department Number 2, everything's in Richmond, everything's in Savannah, Pensacola, and New Orleans. That's where all these troops are going to. So once you punch through that crust, there's no reserves. There's nothing there. So the Confederates would have been in a huge panic. Yeah. But that's Clausewitzian. And Halleck and Buell and McClellan were all Jominian guys, thinking very set piece, capture Fort Henry, pile on supplies. Now where are we going? Fort Donelson looks good, especially after Halleck tells Grant, "I need you to take Clarksville." And Grant reminds him, "Fort Donelson's in the way, sir."
Yeah. So Grant does go over, he takes Donaldson, and we don't have to get into sort of the nitty gritty of that, because I want to talk more big picture here.
Sure.
But he gets over, and the Navy comes around to help him again. This time they're a little less successful. So how does that force Grant to rethink his approach to Donaldson, because he doesn't have the naval support that he had hoped he would have?
Well, the difference between the Fort Henry on the water, Fort Donelson's about 80 feet above the water. So you do get plunging fire, and those ironclad roofs are not armored at all. In fact, I know you've seen the USS Cairo at Vicksburg. That is not what she looked like in this time of the war. In fact, none of those ironclads did. The city class ones, they had vertical armored pilot houses, not slope pillbox pilot houses. And at the battle at Fort Donelson, the USS St. Louis, which is Foote's flagship, is penetrated. The pilot is killed, and Foote gets wounded, wait for it, in the foot with a wooden splinter, like I did that. And he'll die from that wound the following year. And so it just festered, and he was constantly in pain, because you've got a vertical armored box that's easily penetrated as opposed to a pillbox style thing. And then, of course, at the Cairo, they put railroad iron tying in the slope bow armor and the midships armor to add armor plate there. So those, I'm told by a guy that's that now deceased, unfortunately, a expert in ironclads, that was a post-Battle of Memphis tweak of the system. When I've got the Army out there, I talk about that, and I say, well, the Sherman tank of late 1944 was much better than the Sherman tank of 1942. It was a great weapons platform, very dependable, mechanically reliable, fantastic in terms of getting people around and stuff, but we needed to upgun it, up armor it, make the tracks wider. And they would tweak this. Well, the same with the ironclad. The ironclads were a wonderful weapon system. When you throw it into action, fix what needs to be fixed, but you don't go back and reinvent the wheel. And that's what the Navy is going to do. So when you've got that plunging fire, and imagine that the memo, if you will, that's come over from Fort Henry to the Confederates says, The ironclads are invincible. We can't stop them. Jeremy Gilmer, the theater engineer, got out of there. We can't stop the ironclads. Forrest has heard the stuff, and he's standing somewhere by the gun batteries with Major Kelly as Memphis Methodist minister. And he goes, Parson, pray for only God Almighty is going to save this fort. What's his name? I'm brain cramping. Gideon Pillow is sending telegrams to Sidney Johnston. The ironclads are coming. We can't hold for 30 minutes. And then 90 minutes later, we just kicked their tar out. And Sidney Johnston's like, wait, what? What were you talking about? The win there, to me, brings out in Grant what makes Grant Grant. And that is his bulldog tenacity. When I sink my teeth into my objective, okay, I've got plan A. Plan A is not working here. The ironclads didn't win, didn't sail past and go to the Dover Hotel and capture the Confederate logistics point, and we bag the whole garrison. Plan B is I'm going to have to, I guess, assault at some point along the Confederate line once I figure out where the weak point is going to be. And he is going to be constantly getting, to Halleck's credit, once Halleck lets Grant go, Halleck's looking at the map too. Grant is way down here, Polk is up here, Sidney Johnston is up here, and what he's afraid of is those two forces coming down and falling on Grant's rear. A very worthy fear, I think. Now, evidently, Halleck doesn't know squat about Bishop Polk, not wanting to help out very much. And Sidney Johnston will start the fallback from Bowling Green when Fort Henry falls because he can read a map. So the bulldog tenacity is Grant's, okay, I'm going to have plan B. If plan B doesn't work out, I'm going to have to come up with a plan C. And part of that plan is he goes and meets Foote that night, the night of the 14th of February, and begs him to leave at least one of his beat up ironclads on the river. He says, I've got to have a naval threat on the river, or my whole thing's going to fall apart and a lot of guys are going to die trying to get over those breastworks. So Foote will acquiesce and we'll leave a gunboat there and have a naval, and the gunboat's visible from the water batteries. They can see it around the bend just out of the range of the 10-inch and the 6.5-inch rifle Columbiad guns. And then Grant says, okay, we're just going to keep pushing. Plan B is I'm going to push to the south of Dover and get to the hill above the Cumberland River, south of the Dover Hotel, the Confederate logistics point. I'm going to put batteries of artillery there, and I'll cut off their logistics train from that point. Well, they had 5 steamboats that were putting troops and supplies in and out of Fort Donelson, coming out of Nashville to Clarksville and then to Fort Donelson. So there's your plan B. Well, as he's trying to get plan B happening on the morning of the 15th, the Confederates come up with plan A, breaking out, because Sidney Johnston tells them, I need those 17,000 guys you've got there. If you lose those guys, I don't have enough men as it is to hold this whole shebang, so I need those troops. Now, you're not going to get everybody out of there. You'll probably get maybe 13,000 guys out if the plan had been to follow the breakout plan. And I trust we'll discuss that at another point. But that to me signifies Grant. Now look at Grant at Vicksburg. How many times? 6, 7, 8 times?
Yeah.
Tim
7.
Smith's got what, 5 volumes on that now?
That's right.
And yeah, it's like Ed Barce's 3 weren't enough. Tim has to go 2 more. But that shows you Grant. Grant's like, I'm taking that city. I don't care what I got to do to get it. I'm going to get it. I'll dig a canal if I got to. I'll go up the Yazoo. I'll do this. I'll do that. I'll stupidly assault up a straight hill and get slaughtered. Whatever it takes, I'm going to get Vicksburg. And that, to me, is what brings the Grant of 64 going up against Lee. Where he gets beat in the wilderness in Spotsylvania, and everybody's expecting to turn around and go the other way. Like, nope, Richmond's in that direction, and Lee's going to be in front of me. And the Army's like, wait, what? We've never done that before. That's Grant, and that shows up at Fort Henry Donelson.
Now, I love the way you characterize it. Brings out of Grant what makes Grant Grant. So let's say for a second, to me, this is one of the most fascinating what ifs of the war, is like, what if plan A works and the gunboats run past the fort and land at Dover and all that, and then there's no unconditional surrender, and then does Grant become the national celebrity because the Navy captures Fort Donelson instead of the Army? And that's so central to the Grant myth, the unconditional surrender of Fort Donelson.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, because the Navy probably would have. There would have been white flag once they figure out, our logistics point are cut off. We're not going to we've got some food and everything else here, and the gunboats could just sat there, just pulverize the Confederate right flank, which was an easy gunboat range of where the gunboats would have been. And Fort Donelson proper from behind, and there were no guns facing towards the Dover Hotel. They could just pummel the thing. So yeah, they're going to surrender probably again to the Navy. But the bottom line is, I think Grant will get headlines too. Foote will probably get bigger headlines because it would have been a naval thing. I mean, there were massive headlines in the North after Fort Henry fell, just huge headlines. And of course, this is the big one, the unconditional surrender myth, and that's what Ulysses S stands for. And that's a great point. I still think the fact that the Cumberland and the Tennessee are now open, and Nashville is now untenable. Clarksville is untenable. We had our three puny little forts here with 9 guns between them, type stuff. I think Grant will get some of the lion's share of credit, but yeah, it would have probably been a Navy, a Foote patting himself on the back and like, woo, and deservedly so if that's how it would have played out.
Yeah.
That's what it, actually I hadn't thought about that. What if? I'm glad you
Yeah.
brought that up.
It's to me a fascinating contingency, but Donaldson does fall, so now the Cumberland is open, just as the Tennessee is open a little further to the west. This really alters the strategic situation for the Confederates inexorably. I think Johnston does slip the noose, but Nashville falls, and then what's left for the Confederates at that point? Like Johnston's really got to improvise.
Yeah, I actually do a program called Nashville, the Siren Song of the Western Confederacy. There's your throwback to the Odyssey,
Yeah.
tying in that ancient Greek history with the Civil War as only I can do. But I mean, it's the same concept. I mean, it's like it takes Ulysses, Odysseus, however many years to sail back to Greece from the Trojan War, which fascinates me because it was line of sight navigation. Like, really? I mean, come
Yeah.
on, it's not that far. But Nashville then, after the fall, which they fall on the 25th of February, Clarksville falls on the 19th of February. Halleck, or no, excuse me, Buell has marched down from Louisville through Bowling Green, and he's now sitting in Edgefield, Tennessee, which is now Nashville. It's where the Tennessee Titans play football. That was a separate town called Edgefield. And he's sitting across the river looking at Nashville, but he wants some gunboats to show up. So the Cairo shows up with some more troops, and then they pontoon it across, march into town, surrender the city. The 6th Ohio Infantry marches to our state capital, which we're still used today, pulls down the Confederate flag, runs up their national colors, and a gentleman named William Driver comes out of the crowd. He's a Unionist, retired steamboat guy, and he hands him his very large, kind of tattered wool bunting flag. This is the flag I got when I retired from being a steamboat captain, and it's got an anchor in the canton. They hoist it up, and it was a very big flag. And he says, by the way, I call this flag Old Glory. That's where the name comes from. The Smithsonian holds that. So we saw it at our state museum some years ago. And that's the surrender of Nashville. And that's made possible by turning the collapse of Henry and Donelson. And Fort Zollicoffer was never really completed. Clarksville had 3 puny little forts. When Sidney Johnston gets to Nashville, he's stunned that those defenses he's ordered built aren't built. North of town, there were concentric lines of ridges that would have been great fortifications at the bend in the river north of downtown. It would have been a perfect place of plunging fires for about a mile and a half or so before the river curves. Nothing, not because the Nashville people, there's one historian calls them Nashville gods, believe that, well, we got Bowling Green, we got Clarksville, we got Fort Donelson, we didn't need to fortify our city. And of course, Forrest gets there and opens up the warehouse and starts telling people, take all your food that can't be shipped out of town. I mean, it's a calamity. It's huge. But then it sets Confederate strategy for the rest of the war in the Western theater. Hence my siren song of the Western Confederacy. When Odysseus is sailing back to Greece, he's warned against the island with the sirens on it that would sing these songs and lure sailors to their doom on the rocks. And of course, he's tied to his mast, and his crew have wax in their ears, and he wiggles and hears the music and all this stuff. Well, that's what Nashville becomes. It sings the siren song to the Confederates for the rest of the war, and 5 times, directly or indirectly, the goal is to recapture Nashville and then prosecute the war north, starting with Shiloh. Then you got the Kentucky campaign, and then you got the Stones River. If he beats Rosecrans at Stones River, we're going to Nashville. The Atlanta campaign, well, Tullahoma and Atlanta and Chickamauga. If he wins at Chattanooga after the victory at Chickamauga, Grant's going back over the Cumberland Plateau and marching on to Nashville. Of course, the Atlanta campaign, they're going the other direction for a while. And then Hood in November, December of 64 is the fifth and final time. But it's like, say, you and I are opposing football coaches, and we're chit-chatting before the game. And, hey, Chris, here's my defensive playbook. Here's my offensive playbook. We'll see you in 60 minutes of playing time, and let's see how I do against your team. Because you're going to sit there with your coach and go, okay, they're doing. That's exactly what the Union understands. All we got to do, as long as we hold Nashville, when you got Fort Negley and the other massive forts are going to build there, all we got to do is hold Nashville. Everything else will eventually fall into play. And that's exactly what the Union's going to do. Just hold Nashville. Doesn't matter what everything else happens.
And so really there's no way for the Confederates to recover from the loss of these two forts, Henry and Donaldson.
Not the way it plays out.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a huge blow. As probably you are with all the research and books that you do, avid newspaper reader. I was scrolling the London Times online, and I found a article in March of '62, and they were lamenting the fall of Fort Donelson and the capture of Clarksville because they could no longer get Tennessee dark-fired tobacco. That's what our area of Tennessee, wheat and dark-fired tobacco was our big two crops. A number of millionaires were made in Clarksville in the late '50s from tobacco crop. And I mean, lament. So I mean, that affects however many thousand miles London is away from Clarksville, Tennessee, and they're lamenting it. So there's a small economic little tidbit. But I just think, I don't know, and unless they do a mega reinforcement of the Western Theater. And they just never have the manpower to do something like that. They just don't. I mean, what's Lee's biggest army is in the 7 days? He's about 85,000 troops, something like that. That's his apogee. Johnston has, based on ration count, about 85,000 men in the Atlanta campaign, not all at the same time. They move through the army. His apogee is the along the Kennesaw line, where he's got about 75,000 men. That's the biggest that army ever gets. And what's the Army of the Potomac? 110,000 to 120,000 plus. Halleck will command that army group advancing on Corinth after Shiloh. That's 125,000 men. Sherman's army group is 115,000 men in the Atlanta campaign. It's just a man. And then you've got all these other Union garrisons to hold, and armies doing this, and things in the Gulf of Mexico, and things on the coast, and things in Florida, and the Trans-Mississippi. The Union just got guys to spare. And I don't even think they've tapped their entire manpower potential. But whereas the Confederates are, anybody down the bottom of that barrel, we use some more help up here.
Yeah, the conscription act by the end of the war. They're
bleeding
everybody. Now, this does, kind of going back to earlier in our conversation, though, this does force Davis to reassess his defend everything strategy. And this is kind of when he pulls guys out of Pensacola and starts trying to concentrate his army in some way that can perhaps be effective as a counterpunch. But as you said, like, the numbers just don't add up for him.
Yeah, that he's I think been horribly embarrassed by the fact that Beauregard, before the fall of Henry and Donelson, is and other people are sending communication, and Sidney Johnston are sending communication to Davis like, we just don't have the manpower. I'd like to start pulling some guys out of Louisiana, and Governor Moore down there is amenable to that. And Beauregard, being tied in with the state of Louisiana, has convinced Governor Moore that if you want to protect Louisiana, you do it up here in Tennessee, not down, where you are. Because he's got the faith in Forts Jackson and St. Philip and the Chalmette batteries, and being able to stop a Union fleet, which of course doesn't happen.
Yeah,
Unfortunately, it doesn't happen. So Davis shoots that down. Well, now you have to do something. And Sidney Johnston is embarrassed. There goes my cat. Sidney Johnston is embarrassed by this. Richard McMurray talks about a thing that, when a new general takes over, the press is like, he's the greatest general since Napoleon, since Frederick the Great, Caesar and Gaul, whatever. And then they lose a battle. This guy's an idiot. Who put that guy in power type stuff. And that's what Sidney Johnston is now getting caught with, is what an idiot. He doesn't realize what he's doing. So he is highly motivated to rescue this. And that leads to Shiloh. And Davis finally figures it out, like, oh boy, okay, we better do something. So Polk comes down to Corinth. Ruggles Brigade comes up from Louisiana. Bragg brings that army up from Pensacola and Mobile, an exceptionally well drilled army, by the way. And the Army of Central Kentucky, minus Buckner's division, it surrendered at Donaldson, comes down from Bowling Green to Chattanooga, down that Memphis Charleston Railroad, and everybody coalesces at Corinth. And Grant has meanwhile projected power up the Tennessee River to Pittsburgh Landing. He's now gone from 3 divisions to 6. Unfortunately for him, Charles Ferguson Smith has died of an infection. He was getting into a boat and skinned his leg, and no penicillin back in those days, and he dies of an infection. There's a what if for it. What if Charles Smith is at commanding a division at Shiloh?
Yeah.
And that's the reaction. And Beauregard even gets to the point where our noise discipline is terrible. I mean, the Union seeing rabbits and deer running out of the woods, and they're hearing firing in the woods. And I forget what the Ohio regimental commander got out on patrol. He was in Sherman's division, and he comes back and says, "General Sherman, the woods are full of rebels." Like, "Oh, there's not a rebel between here and Corinth. Take your damn regiment back to Ohio." Well, who was surprised not too long after that conversation? To me, the biggest what if of the Civil War is, what if Grant is defeated at Shiloh? Who is Sherman's sort of protector, or guy that raises Sherman up? Grant's going to get fired. Halleck wanted to fire him even after Donaldson. Grant is going to get fired, and that means Sherman never rises up. Who wins the war for the Union in 1864?
Yeah. I mean, and to me, that's, you talk about, there's these moments of contingency with Grant, something I always kind of focus in on. And like, he does not have smooth sailing after Donaldson, but it's his victory there that sort of allows him to survive the terrible victory of Shiloh. He wins, but it's awful and it's stunning and people are shocked, and he doesn't lose his job because he just won something else. We'll kind of give him this one, but he doesn't have like smooth sailing after Donaldson.
No, exactly. And when Halleck, I talk about Halleck bringing that large army. You've got Polk is over in Missouri in the Island Number 10 campaign. He's captured New Madrid. They will take Island Number 10 and Tiptonville, Tennessee. It's about maybe 12,000 Confederates all told between the 3 places that get captured. So he's commanding the Army of Mississippi. They bring him over, and then you got Buell's come down because he sent reinforcements to Grant at Shiloh anyway, several of his divisions. Again, keeping James Negley to hold Nashville, and he had Morgan's division holding Cumberland Gap. And then Ormsby Mitchell's division was in lower middle Tennessee, just kind of guarding middle part of the state. And so you have this giant army group, and Halleck will descend from his lofty perch in St. Louis to take field command as now the Western Department commander. And which, by the way, after the win at Henry Donelson, he basically sends a telegram, to Lincoln and Scott, or Scott's gone. Lincoln and McClellan says, "I asked for command of the Western Department because of Henry Donelson." And he's got a rival with Buell. If Buell wins first, who's going to get the nod? So these guys are reading the newspapers, and who is the one person in the United States that you've got to impress? Abraham Lincoln, right? So, and that's why Lincoln's going to keep him. He's like, well, the guy may have this reputation. Supposedly he says, find out what he drinks and send a bottle to all my other army commanders. The guy fights. The guy's not afraid of a scrap, and he's won Henry Donelson. He barely wins at Shiloh. A barely win is still a barely win. I'll take, like, any landing you can walk away from is a great landing. So that's the way Grant is at Shiloh. He walked away from a bad landing, so to speak. But that cements him. But he's put in the doghouses. Halleck marches that giant 125,000 man army group down to Corinth, and it takes him about a month to do it. You and I could drive it in 30, 40 minutes. But Tom Parson, you probably know him, the ranger down at Corinth, said, you got to understand, he's corduroying his roads because his supply point's Pittsburgh Landing. He's got to haul everything by wagon from there. So the terrain's horrible, it's swampy. So they're laying roads. That's why it takes them so long. And then the Confederates see what's coming. They do some scraping a little bit, Farmington, a couple of little battles, and then fall back to Tupelo. Johnston is killed, of course. Beauregard takes a sick leave, and that elevates Braxton Bragg to command the Army of the Mississippi. And during that campaign, Grant is back in Halleck's doghouse. Thomas is commanding Grant's troops at the time.
Yeah.
if my memory serves. I think it's George Thomas. And then afterwards, when Halleck gets bumped up to Washington, um, Grant resumes commanding the Army of the Tennessee, and he's got Sherman right there by his side. It'll take, Memphis will fall in June, and then you first Vicksburg campaign, et cetera, in December '62.
So just
It's a to me the Western Theater is the dominoes. So you put your dominoes at Henry Donelson and you line them all the way up, all the way down to Georgia, and you just go ding, and then you just watch them fall.
yeah.
Some of them head towards Memphis, some of them head towards Corinth, some of them head towards Chattanooga, and then some dominoes run back up into Kentucky for a little bit, type stuff. But it's one after another, after another, after another, and the rivers are so important in all that.
So as we get wrap up our conversation, and keeping our view on the 30,000 foot that we've been talking, anything you want our listeners to kind of think of as they walk away from this conversation, thinking about Donaldson and Forts Henry and
Yeah,
Donaldson?
I think a lot of people don't look at Donaldson because it doesn't have a huge casualty count. Why are a lot of people are drawn to Franklin for two reasons? It's a forlorn hope charge. It's even bigger than Pickett's charge, and they don't go once; they go five times, and six generals and 50 plus regimental commanders and 9,000 casualties and against entrenched federal troops, some of whom have repeating rifles and stuff. That's a big draw for Franklin. It's a horrible story, and they do an amazing job down there telling that horrible story. And I think Americans like reading about that kind of because it tears at your heart. It's like, oh my God, how could these guys have done this kind of stuff? Well, Henry Donaldson's fairly bloodless. It's 3,000, 4,000 casualties tops for both sides in the whole campaign. 13,000 Confederate prisoners get sent to northern POW camps, which, by the way, neither side has thought about, gee, what do we do when we capture 10, 13,000 guys? Well, your Dix Hill prisoner exchange cartel comes out of that. But still, Forrest ends up, we've revamped the Forrest number. He takes out maybe about 11 to 1,200 guys with him, and another 1,000 or so walk out because Grant has Buckner provost the garrison and stuff, and because the Union guys are like, oh, look at that guy's got cool shoes, he got some money, I'll take that flag, thank you very much. And Bushrod Johnson and his staff walk out to Manny's battery and just do this, and then just walk right out. Well, 1,000 other guys walked right out with him. And then of course Floyd's brigade escapes, and then Pillow and Monty Python bravely ran away, as did Floyd.
Run away,
And
run away.
there you go, and they both commit career suicide pretty much, although Pillow does come back a little bit later. But
Yeah, for that
that's
exceptional
it.
charge at Stones River on the last day, right?
Yeah, I mean Stones River, the third day, the McFadden's ford against what 40 pieces of Union artillery and John Breckinridge, my poor orphans. I mean, it's an amazing story, and I think we're drawn, unfortunately, to a lot of guys dying. And you probably know this from all the years when you talk to your students, are they ever interested in big bloody battles or the Tullahoma campaign, where maybe 2,000 guys in a 3-week campaign killed, wounded, missing. That's I mean, Rosecrans sends the War Department the communication. You should not overlook the noble deeds of this army because it wasn't written in letters of blood. And I tell people, if there have been 30,000 casualties of the Tullahoma campaign, we'd already be 6 or 7 books in instead of 2 or 3.
Yeah. Yeah.
See, and so, but I think Henry Donaldson. I mean, Tim Smith's book came out several years ago. Ken Gott's book is really good. Ben Cooling did the first sort of modern, if you will, study of the Henry Donaldson campaign. They all bring things to the table. I've even gone total nerd and paid about $100 for, well, you can't see it very well. It's called the Fort Henry and Donelson Campaigns 1862, and it was printed in 1923 by the General Service Schools, which is now the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth. And this sucker is, it's as big as a good OR volume. So I paid $100 for that. They go for a lot more, but there's a really, really good recent book on the artillery at Fort Donelson, which the river batteries at Fort Donelson. So if you're an artillery nerd, but there's been more and more little books. Jim Knight's done a book, one of that History Net series. I think there's Daryl Smith up in Cincinnati did a book on the War Department markers that were done in the 30s,
Oh, yeah.
which is really interesting because some are missing today. Uh, there's, I think, more and more being looked at the importance of this because we've been talking big picture the whole time, and that's what Henry Donaldson is. That is big picture because
Yeah.
of everything that projects forth like the tentacles of an octopus, if you will, from the fall of those two forts. I mean, can you imagine the Tennesseans going, we just joined this party and June 8th, 1861, and February 25th, 1862, we lost our state capital. What? We backed the wrong horse here?
Yeah. Wow. So. Well, Greg, I really appreciate the chance to talk with you and sort of unpack this and just see just how significant this campaign was. I appreciate it.
Well, anytime. I appreciate it. And again, I had a really great time when you guys came out a few years ago. And in fact, it took me watching the video of the surrender where I'm doing the thing about the surrender, and you and Gary are behind doing the Buckner Grant thing. I didn't catch that until it's like those two guys doing the handshake
Uh,
back there.
Well,
Just
we'll get you
total
back on
clown.
the program and talk a little bit more about your interest in flags sometime because that'll be a
Sure.
fascinating topic. And dude, I've really appreciated the chance to chat with you tonight.
I am flattered and honored that you asked me to be involved. Keep up the great work. I own a number of wonderful books that Emerging Civil War has published. I've printed off a bunch of essays from the website and keep doing that yeoman's work. We appreciate it.
Oh, thanks so much, Greg.
All right,
I'm
buddy.
Chris
Have a good night
Mikowski
now.
for the Emerging Civil War podcast. We'll see you online and on the battlefield.